Okay, so in this video we're going to talk about sensory processing, and it's important to talk about this because our survival depends on it, and depends on sensation and perception. Sensation is the awareness of changes in the internal and external environment, and then perception is actually the conscious interpretation of those stimuli. And there's only certain things we can perceive, but our body is constantly sensing our internal and external environment to help to modify variables that help to maintain homeostasis. So the one that we're actually able to perceive is our somatosensory system, and it's part of our sensory system that serves the body walls and limbs. The somatosensory system, remember, which is part of the primary somatosensory cortex of your parietal lobe, receives inputs from both exteroreceptors, proprioceptors, and interoceptors. And the input's actually relayed towards our head, and it's processed along the way. Now we can talk about how information is processed and sent in three major levels. We have the receptor level, circuit level, and perceptual level. Now the receptor level is actually going to be, where your receptors are. So we find we have somatosensory receptors in our skin, in our muscles, in our joint capsules. And these receptors could be sensitive to a variety of different stimuli, whether it's pain and temperature, touch, vibration, pressure, stretch. Just ultimately depends on the receptor itself. And once these receptors are activated by stimuli, which would be changes in the environment, that could generate action potentials which get sent back to our central nervous system through nerves, and then along the spinal cord up to what we call the circuit level, which would be areas like your brainstem and your thalamus. So your brainstem actually includes the reticular activating system, which helps to inform our cortex of information that could be ascending. And before we actually get to the cortex, where the perceptual level occurs, information is mostly relayed through the thalamus. Remember, the thalamus is like the sensory sorting, editing, and processing center of our brain. And it actually filters out 99% of sensory information. So only 1% of the information actually makes it to the cortex, where conscious perception occurs. So in this example, we're talking about the primary somatosensory cortex of the parietal lobe. And so this is where the perceptual level would occur here. And you might wonder, why do we have three different levels here? Well, structurally, it makes sense. And functionally, it also makes sense too, because we wouldn't want to send all information to the brain, because then we actually would overwhelm our brain. So we can pick up information all throughout our body. That information gets sent towards the brain, where it's processed at the circuit level. Unnecessary information is filtered out, and then what's important is actually sent to our cortex, where perception occurs. Now, processing at the receptor level occurs in a variety of ways, and for one, we actually need to first generate a signal. Now, generation of a signal occurs when the stimulus excites a receptor, and if the graded potential that occurs is large enough, it could generate an action potential that gets sent to our central nervous system. So the stimulus energy must match the receptor specifically, and the stimulus must be applied within what we call a receptive field. So if the stimulus is outside of the receptive field of that receptor, the receptor can't be activated. And receptors actually transduce this information. So for instance, if it's auditory information, those mechanoreceptors can transduce mechanical stimuli into graded potentials. And depending on where these graded potentials are occurring, we call them different things. So it's a generator potential if it occurs in general receptors, or it's receptor potential if it occurs in special senses. But if these graded potentials are large enough, and get the threshold, they can generate an action potential. And that's where we actually transduce or convert that information from one form to another. So it could be from like mechanical stimulus to electrical, which is the action potential. Now, receptors are also able to adapt, which is kind of cool. And what we say here is that receptors can change their sensitivity in the presence of a constant stimulus. So over time, receptor membranes may become less responsive, or receptor potentials can decline in frequency or stop. And in this regard, we have phasic and tonic receptors. So phasic receptors are fast adapting. We see here that they send signals at the beginning or end of a stimulus, and examples of this could be things like receptors for pressure, touch, and smell. And so because they're fast adapting, they'll actually start sending action potentials less frequently, pretty quickly. So what this means then is that phasic receptors can transduce information, rapidly, but over time they become less and less sensitive. Now this differs from the tonic receptors, which actually adapt slowly or not at all. And an example of this would be like nociceptors and proprioceptors. So for pain and body position, these receptors are always sensitive to stimuli and they don't change how they respond. That differs from phasic because these receptors actually do change how they respond, and this means that they can actually become less sensitive over time. So processing at the circuit level occurs at different levels, and so we actually have first, second, third order sensory neurons. Now, first order sensory neurons are those which conduct impulses from the receptor level towards your central nervous system. So an example of this could be like neuron cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglia of your spinal cord. They have their dendrites in the periphery, and because this is the first place that sensory information is picked up, they're called first order sensory neurons. Now these can communicate with second order sensory neurons, which transmit impulses to third. And so second order would be like the sensory neurons you find in the dorsal horn of your spinal cord, and these would actually send information to the third order sensory neurons, which conduct impulses from the thalamus to the somatosensory cortex. So third order would actually communicate information at the perceptual level. Now processing at the perceptual level is more complex, but there's different aspects of sensory perception we can discuss here. At the perceptual level, we can help detect things like, first of all, whether or not there's a stimulus there. Secondly, how big that stimulus is. And thirdly, where that stimulus is occurring. So we can actually detect it, consciously. We can determine how large it is and where it occurs in our body. And it's important that these three things, co-occur. That way we have a more precise understanding of what that information is. Now, perceptually, we can also kind of divide this into more precise discriminative qualities here. Like, for instance, we can understand the more abstract features of a stimulus, like identifying complex aspects of a shape. We can also have quality discrimination, where we can actually identify submodalities like sweet versus sour or pain versus temperature. We can differentiate the stimuli. It's not just one type of stimulus. And we also have pattern recognition, where we can match a stimulus to a memory of something, and that helps us to recognize patterns in our environment. Now, in terms of pain, it serves an important purpose because it warns our body of impending tissue damage, and that way we can protect our tissues. So stimuli for pain include different things like extreme pressure, temperature, histamine, which is an inflammatory molecule, potassium, ATP, and acid, which are all released during tissue damage, as well as bradykinin, which is also an inflammatory molecule. Now, impulses travel on nerve fibers that release neurotransmitters like glutamate and substance P. So we think about these as being the neurotransmitters of pain. And some pain impulses are blocked by inhibitory opioids like endorphins. So when you hear about people who, sort of like in the heat of the moment, can ignore their broken bone in order to run away from danger, that's in part due to the fact that they can release endogenous opioids which block pain transmission, and this includes endorphins. Now, pain tolerance is that pain perception varies. And so all pain is transmitted at the same stimulus intensity regardless of the individual. But pain tolerance varies because individuals can be more or less sensitive to pain. But this doesn't relate to the number of action potentials that are transmitted. Rather, it relates to pain perception, sort of at a conscious level. And what's really interesting here, too, is that there are genetic influences to pain tolerance. And so researchers are actually looking at how genes can be used to help determine the best pain treatment, and because not everyone responds to pain the same way. Now, there's different types of pain. We actually have visceral and referred pain. Visceral pain results from stimulation of visceral organs, hence the name. So it's often felt as like a vague, aching, gnawing, burning sensation. Like if you say, like, oh, my tummy aches, it's just sort of a general pain all over. and it's activated by tissue stretching, ischemia, chemicals, or muscle spasm. Now, referred pain is also kind of odd because it's pain from one body region that's perceived as coming from a different region. And an example of this would be where like left arm pain is felt during a heart attack. So that pain that originates from the heart could actually be felt like it's originating from the left arm. And this is because the visceral and somatic pain fibers travel along the same nerves. So your brain assumes the stimulus is coming from the common region, which if it's from your heart, it can also be felt like it's coming from your left arm. And so this is actually showing some of the common sites of referred pain. So all these color-coded regions show where pain of an organ could be felt like it's coming from. So for instance, pain of the liver and gallbladder can be felt in the right shoulder. Pain from your lungs and diaphragm can be kind of felt on your left shoulder and neck. Pain of the heart can be felt on your neck and jawline as well as radiating down your left arm. Pain from the vermiform appendix can be kind of felt around the umbilicus. Pain from the kidneys can kind of be felt all over the abdominal region, even extending down the thigh, lateral and medial parts of your thigh. Pain from the small intestine can kind of just be felt right in the middle of your stomach. Pain from the ovaries actually felt pretty high up too. So ovaries should be way down here, but pain from the ovaries can actually be felt higher up in the abdominal area. And then pain of the urinary bladder is just sort of generally felt in the pelvic cavity. So this is important to note because if a patient complains of pain in a certain body region, this might actually be referred pain from a different organ. So if someone complains of left arm pain, they could be having a heart attack. Or if someone complains of pain of their right shoulder, it could be gallstones or something associated with the liver. Or even pain from the lungs and diaphragm could be felt on the neck, which is odd. But these are important to consider in terms of understanding the sources of pain and how that could relate to internal organs. Now remember, we call this referred pain because it's essentially where the somatic nerve fibers share a common pathway to the brain from a visceral organ. So as far as our brain's concerned, it can't differentiate pain from an organ from pain from a different body part. And the reason why this occurs is just that's kind of how our anatomy is, and it's unavoidable. And this is showing an average of referred pain, and referred pain can be different from person to person, but these are some of the common sites of referred pain.